This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Roger Lewis. He is the writer of Erotic Vagrancy, everything you need to know about Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, The Life and Death of Peter Sellers, and the book we're going to be concentrating on today is his biography of Charles Hawtrey, the actor most famous for the Carry On movies. I've wanted to talk to Roger one more time because we've already talked to him about Erotic Vagrancy and it was a great episode. I really enjoyed it. But this book about Charles Hawtrey really piqued my curiosity, so I wanted to have another conversation with him about that and about the Carry Ons, which have a peculiar and particular place in my heart, as they do in many film goers' hearts, especially British ones of my generation. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like, review, subscribe, spread the word throughout the world of social media, spread the word throughout the world of the world. Just talk to people about it and get them, if they are so inclined, to subscribe and listen as well. Next week I'm going to be at the Bologna Film Festival, Cinema Ritrovato, which is a wonderful festival which will be reviving classics. I'm looking forward to that. It's my first time there, and I will be doing a Writers on Film Festivals episode from there. And we also will have another guest for Writers on Film, so I'm not sure if we're going to be having maybe even 2 episodes next week, one for the film festival and one regular episode. After that, I will be going to the Carlo Vivari Film Festival, and there will be another episode, maybe 2, coming from that festival there. So a lot to look forward to in the coming weeks. And yeah, okay, enough announcements. Oh, one last thing. If you're interested in James Bond, and specifically the James Bond books, there is a new podcast series which will be coming from me, from the Bleasdale podcast empire, called the James Bond Book Club, in which I will read each of the books in chronological order and discuss them with a different guest every week. Casino Royale with Neil Alcock will start soon, will be dropped soon, and if you wish to hear that, please subscribe. There's already a trailer out. You can find it at Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts from. It shall be available. Okay, all right, I think that's enough of my nonsense. Let's listen to the episode. did Hayes go with Stephen Fry? It must have been hard after being interviewed by me to, slum it with the likes of Fry.
Yes, it was. It was an incredible come down, of course. But I actually got this last minute invitation from Hay on Wye to go, because it was at Stephen's instigation, his idea to do it. So I wasn't in their printed catalogue. I was just sort of added in at the last minute. But I think because most people book up and look at what's going on online, that didn't seem to matter too much. And we had a full tent, and it was at Hub Estate in the evening, one of the last events, and it was great. And he knew the book really well, and he knew all my other things I'd written, so he could talk about those as well. And it was just like a real conversation rather than one of those, because I've been to author events at Hay and Wye in the past in the audience. A lot of authors are really very stilted. They have absolutely no skills at doing all the performing side of things. And so they'd be asked a question and then they'd answer it in a sort of very dry, slightly boring way. And then there'd be another question. And this is how it would go for an hour. And it would be very awkward. And you'd be thinking, oh, dear, I'm not sure I want to read this person ever again. He's so lacking in charisma. So anyway, I'll tell you what helped. In the green room, and they also had a restaurant for the artistes, there was a free bath. So that sort of loosened me up a bit.
A little lubrication.
A little bit of lubrication and Dutch courage. And I think it was all right. Maybe it was terrible, I don't know, but I survived it.
I'm sure.
And of course, we had all this controversy, which is ongoing controversy now, about Bailey Gifford and all these sponsors who are being told to, they've been given their money back and told to get lost because they all these sort of priggish people and all these activists disapprove of how they've come by some of their money, which is ridiculous. We can't insist on total moral purity from everybody. Otherwise, nothing would ever happen. And it's not as if money for cultural events is easy to come by.
To the point about sort of hearing people, writers especially, who are not particularly good at sort of public speaking. I remember Nabokov always insisting that interviewers give him written questions and he would give them written replies. That's how he liked to do it.
Yes, that's all control, isn't it? And Philip Larkin, when he did the South Bank show, he didn't actually appear. It was all written answers and questions all in advance, and he'd play that cat and mouse game, as Graham Greene did as well. It's their version of trying to remain private, I think. But when you do turn up, I think you do have an obligation to try and entertain people. So I went to see someone called Norman Lewis, who's no relation of mine, a great travel writer, and it was just sort of embarrassing the way he couldn't really answer anything with much coherence.
I just think it's great to have like storytelling, and I feel this with film directors as well. The great film directors are often the best storytellers in real life, like Orson Welles and John Huston.
Oh yeah, they were marvelous, weren't they? I mean, Orson Welles, his interview, because quite a few on YouTube, I think, and they're just gripping. They're so wonderful. That wonderful voice of his, and the stories, and the tall stories very often. And he was the sort of person that would be the ideal person to have dinner with, wouldn't he? He would just be so great. And as you say, John Huston, he was another great storyteller. And all their anecdotes about the people they worked with and the things they did.
So I wanted to talk to you specifically about the Charles Hawtrey book that I ordered after our last conversation and read, and and it's such a different book from your other books in the sense of its size as an obvious.
Yeah, that's right. It's a little book about a little person in a way. I wanted it to be really sort of sharply done and not going into huge, massive detail about everything, because after all, I'd written about Peter Sellers, I'd written about Laurence Olivier, Anthony Burgess, these big figures, these big, important cultural figures. Hawtrey certainly is not in that league, not in that realm, but he is nevertheless beloved. We all enjoy watching Charlie Hawtrey in the Carry On films, and I just wanted to write an appreciation of him. and to try and write a sort of short, slightly campy, astringent book that would reflect the kind of performances he gave, the sort of character actor, making these brilliant cameo appearances in all these films, and with Kenneth Williams and Sid James and Hattie Jakes and that great Carry On crowd.
I mean, the funny thing is that although he isn't, as you say, a Peter Sellers or a Laurence Olivier, I always have in my head the fact that he's like a household name. He's somebody who's right there in the front of my imagination from when I was a child, which is, I guess, when most of us watch Carry On films. Because, in fact, I'm not sure I've ever watched a Carry On film as an adult. I think I've watched them all up until when I was 16, 17. And especially because I no longer live in England, I don't have them on, I can't happen upon them,
Yeah. Well, I think today you can find them on ITV Catch Up or whatever it's called. They do exist. And of course, I've got all the DVDs. Well, all the VHSs, I think, as well, prior to that. Because I love the Carry Ons. I mean, they're really a window on the 1960s, the 1970s. It's an England that doesn't exist now at all. It probably didn't quite exist in that fashion then, but they're sort of shabby, aren't they? They're sort of badly made, cheaply made, full of continuity errors. They never did any retakes. They were made very quickly. And they're like seaside postcards. I mean, there's another thing people don't do anymore is send postcards or even go to the English seaside. There's a sort of end of the pier vulgarity about them. And so for me, they're profoundly nostalgic because, yes, as you say, they're the sorts of things we watched because they were always on the telly when we were teenagers. And also they're out with Barbara Windsor with her big boobs and so on, and all these girls running around in their bathing costumes. They were the first intimation of sex, actually. And the films are full of all this sort of leering at all the crumpet. Again, you couldn't do that now. Terribly politically incorrect. Sid James and Bernard Bresslaw sort of gazing at the girls on the camping sites or, when they want to go to a nudist colony and all this kind of thing. And they're films about this sort of English frustration about sex, because no one successfully manages to form relationships. They're either these young girls that they don't have access to, or when they're married, the women instantly become terrible ratbags. They become journalists, The minute they get married, overnight, come back from honeymoon, and they turn into Joan Sims. There's a lot there, a lot of signs and symbols and messages, I think, in the Carry On films about how useless the British are when it comes to eroticism. And that's actually one of the themes running through those films. It's tremendous frustration.
One of the people that you sort of particularly sort of pick out as someone you don't like in the Carry On films, is it Kenneth Connors?
I find him incredibly unfunny.
Yeah, and that specific thing he has of reacting to being turned on by sort of falling into a whole series of sort of mannerisms and tics and sort of
Yes, this frenzy. Kenneth Connors in this frenzy of sexual frustration from start to finish, and he's either playing a sort of old general or old colonel that's still randy but can't actually do anything about this, and so, as you say, he's just convulsed. But the others I adore. Bernard Bresslaw, I think, is a fascinating person. He's about 7 foot tall, I think he was. He's really a huge man. Mm-hmm. And Terry Scott, I always find very funny and sort of slightly sinister too. So there's something creepy about Terry Scott. There's one of the ones, Carry On, Again Doctor or Carry On Matron or one of these things, because that's the other thing, they all merge to me. I can't really tell these films apart. It's just that one enormous film rather than lots of separate ones. But anyway, he's a doctor and he's sort of going after the student nurses. I mean, terrible things, really. I'm rather surprised the Carry On films have not been cancelled and no one's allowed to watch them anymore because of they wouldn't pass the puritanical laws which now prevail. But Sid James, he's always after sort of younger women. Barbara Windsor, he's always chasing after her, which he did in real life, I believe. So they are this strange sort of hothouse feeling of all the lurid colour, that pulsating greens and yellows and reds they had, the film stock, whatever that was. There's this element of the surreal about them now when you look back.
I was going to ask actually if there were any shenanigans going on backstage, because there were so many shenanigans going on, obviously, in front of camera.
Well, I think Kenneth Williams was always flashing everyone, and people didn't mind, but it must have been sort of a bit embarrassing. I think Charlie Hawtrey was always chasing after the carpenters and the grips and the stage hands. He was quite sort of shamelessly always cruising around. And Sid James with Barbara Windsor, and I think they did have an affair. Off screen, when during those brief moments when she wasn't married to gangsters.
When she was between gangsters.
Between gangsters, yeah. She was, I was reading the other day, she used to be a regular at those nightclubs that the Cray twins used to operate. And all part of that East End gangster world, and where she was always welcomed, and she loved it. She loved the excitement of that, I think. She was a wonderful person, Barbara Windsor, a great actress too. As we know from EastEnders, she plays serious characters, troubled people, and ferocious people too, as well as sort of being bubbly and blonde and busty, which she is in the Carry Ons. And she did a lot of stuff with in that Theatre Royal, Stratford East, with Joan Littlewood. Very accomplished person, and fully deserved her damehood. I'm glad she was elevated, because people who do or are associated with doing comedy, they're seldom honoured. It should have been Sir Ronnie Barker, shouldn't it? It should have been Sir Arthur Lowe. It should have been, Sir Kenneth Williams, why not? But no, they only normally honour people that do things at the National Theatre.
That's true. I wanted to go back to your point about end of the pier stuff as well, because one of my favourite jokes of the Carry Ons, I think it's from Carry On at Your Convenience, is when Kenneth Williams offers, I'm not sure if it's Hattie Jakes or one of the other actresses, some whelks, and she says, "No, they do stuff to you. They do stuff, don't they? Sexual like." And he goes, "Oh, let's watch."
Yeah, that's right. It's Carry On at Your Convenience, and it's the one about the lavatory factory.
That's right.
Or the sanitary ware factory, and they go on a works outing to Brighton, and as you say, there they are on the seafront, with all this kinky food, all the seafood, and I think it's Kenneth Williams. He says to Charlie Hawtrey in that, "Let's go on the pier and have a winkle." I always thought was a wonderful line. And they're all running around on the pier there and having this sort of very English seaside holiday, bank holiday day out. They all arrive on a charabanc. Charlie Hawtrey is in the boot because he's drunk, so they just put him in with the luggage. And in fact, he did get drunk in real life on the set. And sometimes you see him in the Carry On Abroad. He's on the beach, and he's just passed out in the back. He's meant to be as if he's sunbathing, but he was there because he's paralytic. And Carry On Spying, I think he's recumbent. And the one, and as I say, when they put him in the back of the coach in Carry On at Your Convenience, but he because they never did any retakes. Because Peter Rogers and Gerald Thomas were trying to rush through the material, get it done under budget so they could pocket the money themselves, and they never shared out the money with the cast. They kept all the receipts for themselves. So they were very penny pinching about making these films. So if Hawtrey was drunk, they just have to leave him in shot and drunk, and he'd turn up at the studio every day with a sort of lemonade bottle, but it was full of gin. And then in the end, the alcoholism, they started not to use him, or not to use him as much, and he just ended up in a seaside resort called Deal on the Kent coast, quite a long way from London, about 2 or 3 hours from London, and this ended his days as a sort of rather forgotten, sad figure. I think maybe he did a bit of pantomime here and there, but he couldn't really get work because he was typecast as a Carry On actor. And then he couldn't get work because he was considered a drunk and a risk. And because he couldn't get work, he drank even more and became more of a risk. So it was a sort of very sad downward spiral towards despair and neglect and death. But one of the things that interests me about comedians is that so many of them end up like that. Tony Hancock, committed suicide. And so Peter Sellers, very sad, morose figure at the end. There's despair and sadness, never far off with all these people.
And of course, Spike Milligan, there was sort of mental health issues and depression there as well.
Oh, yeah, well, he was always in and out of the asylums having electroconvulsive therapy. He connected all of that back to when he was in the war and was near bombs when they were going off. So he had all this sort of post-traumatic stress syndrome stuff, which of course wasn't diagnosed as that back in those days. He would just have uncontrollable trembling and shaking and crying and breaking down because he was all the things he'd witnessed in the war in North Africa, and then he was part of the army going up across Sicily and then up through Italy. A lot of those comedians in the 50s, they'd all been in the war in the 40s, including Harry Seacombe and Peter Sellers. Also, Peter Sellers served in Burma. And I often wonder whether the goon of comic reliving or refighting of the war, it's full of explosions, isn't it? And army jokes and Major Bloodnock and Hitler jokes. And the audience was all in, the live audience was all made up of fellow servicemen. And so they had that camaraderie, which is why now the Goons, for example, seems rather dated, because it's very connected to its era with a lot of wartime reminiscence. Whereas the Carry Ons, they have this, as I say, this sort of lurid, strange, Kodachrome colour that I associate with the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, and it's kind of coming out of the 60s, and as you were saying earlier, there's this sort of innocent attitude towards sex, and this sort of bungling, a lot of bungling, repressed attitude, and it feels like, just as we were talking about Barbara Windsor being between gangsters, it feels like this could only exist between a period of repression and a period of liberation, just that transition period.
Yes, because the 60s weren't really that swinging, not really. No. And you can tell that from the Carry On films, with, as you say, all this terrible bungling going on. And I mean, Carry On Camping, you've got Sid and Bernie Bresslaw trying to take their girlfriends to a nudist colony. And it all goes wrong, and they end up in a different kind of a place run by Peter Butterworth, a sort of little caravan site, really. I remember going to see that in the cinema in, oh God, I must have been about 10 or 11, something like this. And there was this sort of burgeoning excitement about, seeing knockers, which is what they were called in those days, because you didn't have pornography, you didn't have anything online. You'd sort of maybe find anthropological books in the school library about
National Geographic,
exactly, when they'd have these sort of feature articles about African tribes of bare-breasted women, and that's the nearest you could ever get, ever, to seeing what things look like. So that is all very strange now. Young people wouldn't even be able to imagine what that world must have been like, where everything was hidden from us, and you weren't meant ever to, shall we say, do it until you were married. So, and all that, matrimony was the only way you could ever know about these great mysteries of life. So it's no wonder everyone in Britain was cross-eyed with lust. The Carry On movies are about that kind of thing. Now, I mean, you're there in Italy, and it's not like that, is it? A Catholic world is not like this. There's no embarrassment and puritanical Protestant loathing of the human form.
I was watching Ieri Oggi Domani, the Vittoria De Sica comedy with Sophia Loren and Mastroianni yesterday, and my daughter turned around and said, "Wow, this is so frank." They're talking about Sophia Loren having to get pregnant to avoid prison until she's got like 7 children, and there's a prostitute in Rome, and everybody knows about it, and it's that's true, it is. But at the same time, when I first came to Italy, which was 1999, so long past the days of Carry On, one of the most popular programs on daytime TV was like reruns of Benny Hill. Yeah. So there's a strange that it's, I don't know, maybe it's just because it looks like silent comedy, so it's easy for them to watch. Yes,
that's the thing. If you like Mr. Bean or Chaplin, or you've got some silent comedy routine, then that can be sold all over the world. It's very profitable because you don't have to dub the language or anything of that kind. But the thing about Benny Hill now, he's actually for quite a long time, he has been pretty much removed from our screens. He's been stamped out, quite wrongly, because people think he's a dirty old man chasing all these busty women. In fact, if you ever watch those routines, the women are all chasing Benny, and he's the one running for his life. But yes, he was always very popular abroad, and I used to think he was really funny. His comic Chinaman and things, which of course you wouldn't be allowed to do today. There's so much you're not allowed to do today. It's just such a censorious world. People have become primly Victorian again, about laughter and what we're allowed to make jokes about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strange thing that, like we were talking about earlier, there's an element that we're more puritanical these days. There's sort of people talk about, oh, do we really need sex scenes in movies and all this sort of stuff? And yet on the other side of that, there's never been more access to hardcore pornography, and so. And also it leaking into the mainstream. So it's and apps and all, a whole vocabulary of sex, which is in the mainstream that we talk about. We see T-shirts emblazoned with. It just seems a very I don't know. It's odd. And
yes, it's all rather mechanistic, though. And what I do like about the cross-eyed world of the Carry Ons and all that kind of era, it's very coy, strangely innocent. And then when you look into it a bit more deeply, this was the time, this was the era when the likes of Jimmy Savile were going about their business. So in the background, there is real horror. But then maybe always there's that. I mean, Dickens's novels really are full of the sexual terror. I mean, Oliver Twist, Fagin and all those boys, it's really just some sort of paedophile hell, isn't it? All these, and in Chaplin, his flower girls are really prostitutes. It's a sort of landscape or panorama or rooms, interiors that would have been painted by Walter Sickert with all that Jack the Ripper resonance.
I mean, nowadays we have Russell Brand.
Well, everyone loved him for ages, and now he is, of course, vilified, and all these women that he seduced now saying that they wish they hadn't been seduced. So he's gone from he's now become a villainous figure, hasn't he, in the popular mind. And people that I think Last Tango in Paris isn't that now? People all questioning that about the girl in it and how much she was coerced into doing those scenes with Brando, and there's
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
All this retrospective analysis of classic films and art and books and pictures and personalities, and now they're being vilified in ways they weren't at the time.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, I think it's a fascinating. It's like a fascinating thing to look at. I think that in terms of actual cancellation, that it's often overstated. I mean, Blazing Saddles, people always say, "Oh, you couldn't make this today," as they watch it for the 100th time on television, where it's being showed quite comfortably. No woman, it's not exactly disappeared or been suppressed or anything. So,
yes, that's right. It's still there, isn't it? Because it's actually a parody of, a satire on racism, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was written by Richard Pryor. You couldn't get better bona fides for that. And even in terms of, say, the Carry Ons, it's almost as if in their own sort of making, they kind of killed themselves by going into sort of Carry On Emmanuel territory,
that was awful. They tried to modernize themselves in a way, and then it just wasn't funny anymore when it was all just more blatant. When they're having to get round the censor, it's much better than when they were just being more sort of overt. Because there's a marvellous line in Carry On Camping where Charlie Hawtrey they're in a sort of a big shop that's selling camping equipment and stuff, and there's all this sort of rattling inside and vibrating noises coming from inside this tent, and Charlie Hawtrey comes out from inside it with some busty shop assistant, I think played by Valerie Leon, I think. And Hawtrey's line is, "Oh, she was just helping. She was just showing me how to stick my pole in." And they thought, "Oh, that's terribly rude. You can't have that." So they had to redub that line as, "Oh, she was showing me how to stick my pole up."
I don't see how that's any better.
The tent pole, you see, it was about the tent pole, but it was a double entendre in a way.
Sounds more like a single entendre.
Yeah, well, he had the tent pole in his hand, and they were in he was looking at this little camping tent. So it was completely innocent, and then also completely rude. And you could take it either way, really. When I saw that film when it first came out, and I was a kid, I would have just thought he was describing the tent pole. What else could it possibly have been? So But as you said at the start, the book's very different than my other ones, and it was. I just wanted to do this appreciation of a beloved and overlooked figure. No one would ever commission you to write a big, huge study of Charles Hawtrey. So to do what was really like an extended essay, I thought sort of suited him. It's a sort of a little book about a little person.
We already said, said in a sense, we sort of started a little bit at the end, because he's always worried at the end of his career that he would be typecast, and so he sort of never really got himself back off the ground. But did he have a pre-Carry On career? I mean, I got the sensation from reading your book that, he appeared here or there, but you include a whole slew of sort of rejection letters in a sense.
Terrible, yeah, I know. I came across in the I think it was in the BBC archives or the British Film Institute archives, one of these sorts of places. There are all these sort of letters from him that he painstakingly typed to everyone, asking, when you're next casting your play or your drama or your film, whatever, please don't forget me, and these are the things I've done. And these are all individually typed, these letters, and there were loads of them to all the producers and the directors and everyone he could think of in that world. And he'd get all these very polite little rejections coming back, because what he was before Carry Ons, he was a child actor in films with Will Hay, where he'd play a sort of schoolboy in the class, with Will Hay being a sort of flustered schoolmaster. He was in loads of those. Then I noticed he'd turn up in little roles in really interesting things like Powell and Pressburger's Canterbury Tale. He's someone who's working in a railway station, sort of like a guard on the platform. Then he's in Passport to Pimlico, in lots of scenes in that. He doesn't have many lines, but he's sort of part of the ensemble of the people in Pimlico who were all isolated, turning it into a little foreign country within London. And he's playing the piano and things in the pub. So he turns up in little films. There's a film with Kenneth More called Brandy for the Past. He has these little parts. I've seen him play a bookie in a film called The March Hare. And a film is, I think, is quite funny, about the Loch Ness Monster called What a Whopper, it's called. He's in that as well as a sort of avant-garde artist or something. So he had lots of tiny little roles here and there. He was doing stuff on radio. He was a boy soprano, and he recorded various sort of numbers which used to be played on the radio. So he did all this kind of stuff, but it was only the Carry Ons where he took off. And I think, to everyone's surprise, he was the one that people looked forward to when he came on and did his performances. And as he got slightly older, as he was born in 1914, so what's that, 110 years? Yeah, no, I was just saying, all these actors and actresses in the Carry On films, they were unable to get work in other things because they were typecast, and that did lead to a fair bit of bitterness. Joan Sims, for example, she ended up not very much money because they were just paid a flat fee. They didn't get any residuals. They weren't, the profits weren't shared with them. They would just get a couple of grand to do their few weeks. And they could have done more and other things if people had taken the risk and cast them. Mm-hmm. So I do think that's a shame. And as I say, Hawtrey ended up on the Kentish coast in a town called Deal, which in those days had the Royal Marines School of Music. So he was attracted to live there because of the soldiers, and he'd go and try and pick them up in the pubs and stuff. And gradually he was barred from every single public house in the town and in the vicinity because he was just like a nuisance. And he would be very grumpy and grouchy, and if people asked for his autograph, he'd sort of start swearing at them and throwing things around. So in real life, he became very different to how he was on the screen, which is very sweet-natured. And in real life, he just became rather vituperative, I believe.
No, that's really sad. Sad part of the book as well is this sort of disconnect. It's similar, I mean, in that sense. It's sort of similar to Peter Sellers, where if you watch the films, you'd want to sit down and have a drink with him, and go for dinner with him. But after reading your book, you'd want to run 100 miles.
I know. Well, even Blake Edwards said that if you went into an insane asylum and saw the most mad person there incarcerated, that would be Peter Sellers. I mean, he was so difficult because he was so insecure about his genius. He didn't know each day when he turned up on the set whether he'd be funny, whether the genius and the inspiration would come. I mean, imagine living with that all the time, not knowing the source of why you're any good and not knowing whether you're going to be any good. The insecurity for that was totally different to Laurence Olivier, who had utter confidence and could repeat a bit of business 1,000 times, and each time it would look fresh and new and original. He was much more implacable in that respect, in that regard, and he was so full of incredible, terrifying confidence, like some kind of Shakespearean king, which of course he played often enough on the screen and on the stage, whereas Sellers was so full of doubt. And Hawtrey as well, full of doubt and bitterness and loneliness towards the end. And you sort of could see that coming really in the distance as he was becoming more difficult for everyone to work with and deal with. The Barbara Windsor was very fond of him, and she always said he was her favourite. And she thought he was the funniest in his films, which I think he was. I always get, to this day, if it's a Carry On film on, the Hawtrey scenes will be the best. He hasn't dated at all. In fact, it gets strangely better because there's no one like that now, with all that sort of suppressed camp. Now it would be sort of Julian Clary or somebody. It would be all very overt.
Oh, who indeed starred in a Carry On, a very unsuccessful one.
Yes, they did a sort of revamp, didn't they, years later, called Carry On Columbus, and he's in that. And he's got lines like he's sort of sitting on a bench or something on the ship, and he says to somebody, he says, "Oh, would you like to come up my end?" You know, things like that. And Hawtrey would never have said something openly filthy. It would just, as I said, the word I used earlier, it was much more coyly done.
Do you think earlier we were talking about how this coyness? I'm always thinking about sort of Kenneth Williams and Charles Hawtrey as being gay men who are to some degree kind of allowed to be gay in a period in which it isn't,
Well, it was illegal. They would have gone to prison. It would have been like Joe Orton, wouldn't it? Off to jail they would have gone, or Oscar Wilde, because the same laws were being applied, and the police they were tremendous bullies going after and entrapping the gays in public lavatories and things like this. I mean, it was just terrible, awful. Though, of course, Francis Bacon, the painter, when it was all legalized, he was very disappointed, disapproving, because he said, well, all the fun, all the danger's gone now. All the sort of the clandestine side of things, which is what he appreciated.
You've always got to have a minority opinion, haven't you?
Yeah, well, but the thing with Hawtrey and Kenneth Williams, I was thinking about this the other day. Even though it was illegal, and even though there was terrible homophobia everywhere, God, growing up in South Wales where I was, the slightest thing, even to sort of do your homework on time or be interested in the subject, or not mind school so much. We're a puff. People were very quick to say, "Oh, you're a puff," unless you were sort of playing rugby all the time and drinking beer. And yet this was the era of Kenneth Williams, a big star, and Larry Grayson.
Shut that door.
Yeah, and John Inman in Are You Being Served, and Charlie Hawtrey. And, even Bruce Forsyth obviously wasn't gay, but there was a sort of high camp manner that he had, tap dancing around. So light entertainment was full of these high camp hijinks. And one of the most famous singers at the time, all the old ladies absolutely adored him, was Liberace. So even though it was against the law, it was on the telly all the time. And I don't remember it ever being sneered at. It was always enjoyed as if, oh, well, this is what light entertainment is. What else would you expect?
It's funny because the same is true here. There's
in macho culture.
Yeah, there are daytime television is full of people who are of guys who are very obviously gay, very extravagantly camp. Not so much today, but certainly when I first arrived, there was still a sense of very strong homophobia. I think it still exists today, obviously, but I think things have greatly improved in the last 20 years in Italy, and that includes sort of openness in terms of gay actors and gay musicians and what have you. So in the culture itself has opened up a lot more than was the case. There's one sort of division that I always have in my head with the Carry Ons, and because you were saying they're like all one movie, but I often think the ones where they were more sort of costume films, like the Carry On Cleo or Carry On Screaming or Carry On Up the Khyber, you always seem to me to stand a little bit higher up in my estimation than the more sort of the Ken Loach ones where Carry On Camping, or could it's Mike Lee does a Carry On film. So
well, you're absolutely right that the as it were, the modern day one now look as if Ken Loach might have been involved, or Mike Lee might have been somewhere on the crew, because what was modern day then now is very historical indeed, as historical as when they're going up the Khyber or up the Nile, And the marvelous story, of course, about Carry On Cleo is that they were using all the leftover sets and costumes from Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. So you've got Sid James in Burton's old costumes, and in Carry On Henry, where he's Henry VIII, again, Sid James is wearing the costumes Richard Burton wore in Anne of a Thousand Days. And the films look better because the production values look better because they're using all these discarded, professionally made costumes and sets. And the one about going up the Khyber, carrying up the Khyber, that was filmed on location in North Wales. The one about the Foreign Legion was filmed in Camber Sands near Rye, near Hastings. So they left the vicinity of Pinewood briefly. Though, of course, when they made Carry On Abroad, the one about package holidays, the resort of, I think it's called Elsbells, I think the resort. that was, they just got some sand and sprinkled it over the car park at Pinewood and pretended it was, Benidorm or somewhere. But Talbot Rothwell wrote the classic scripts with all the great lines and situations. And I think he'd been a prisoner of war, as had Peter Butterworth, I believe. Maybe they were even in Colditz or somewhere like that. They had terrible times. So as I said to you earlier on, a lot of the silliness of British comedy was because these people had been through hell in the war, and they were now determined never to take anything serious, never to take things seriously ever again. And maybe the trouble now, my comedy, today's comic landscape is so barren and puritanical and unfunny and rude and coarse and one-dimensional, is people really, they have nothing to react against. They've never known horror or terror or starvation or imprisonment. There's nothing to react against.
It's sort of more like they're just making comedies based on, what they watched on television and admired.
Yes, well, even Victoria Wood, who I adored, nevertheless, she's so derived from Alan Bennett. It's all Victoria Wood as seen on TV, and all the sketches are parodies of TV shows. Even Acorn Antiques, wonderful as it is. That's just you need to know about Crossroads and terrible daytime soaps. So just making television out of old television.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And you know, The Office is again. I'm a huge fan of The Office. I'm a huge fan of Extras, but they're all about sort of mock documentaries, or in the case of
Yeah.
Extras, you know, people who work in the film industry.
Yes, it's all rather feeding off itself, isn't it? It's sort of cannibalistic, incestuous, you could almost say, but it's television made out of television. Um,
So you're not saying, Roger, that we need another world war
well, we might get one any minute, the way things are going.
to
But
spice up the comedy? We
spice
need.
up, give people something to worry about. No, but I do think that great comedy does come out of adversity. On the whole, there hasn't been a lot of adversity in recent decades. So they invent problems, you know, like wokery and political correctness. You suddenly decide to get terribly upset about the fact the British had an empire once upon a time, or slavery was rampant, you know, in the 16th century, whenever it was. So these things to me seem very contrived to be worried about and concerned about, and actually rather phony, because they're just sort of pretend causes rather than genuine ones. But the other thing about comedy, old comedies, old comic shows, is that eventually they sort of become tragic. They become less funny and more full of tragedy when you realize that these people's empty, doomed lives. As I say, City Lights, Chaplin with the flower girls who are really prostitutes, and the interiors that look as if Walter Sickert painted them, they become interesting in a different way than they were at the time.
I mean, that's true of like even television comedy, like beloved things like Steptoe and Son and
Steptoe and Son. I mean,
the rise and
Steptoe.
fall of Reginald Perrin. I mean, there are so many. Blackadder is on the First World War has a
Exactly. That's very, and there's brilliant acting too, isn't it? They're not just sort of strutting around coming out with lines. I mean, they're comic actors rather than comedians in all these things. Harry H. Corbett interests me a lot, and Wilfrid Bramble, and the whole thing about Steptoe and Son really is that it's Samuel Beckett, isn't it? These two tramps trapped together for eternity. It's like some malign marriage. And Leonard Rossiter, the great comic genius, and is Reggie Perrin or as Rigsby in Rising Damp. Again, these are serious performances. They're only inadvertently funny. I mean, they're rather horrific, the way Rigsby's creeping around that tenement of his, bursting in through doors.
It's 10 Rillington Place, really.
It's 10 Rillington Place. Rigsby, it could be Christie, couldn't he?
Absolutely. Or Fred West.
Sort of strangling and gassing his tenants, and then hiding them in the walls.
I mean, Only Fools and Horses, and I would add any of Ronnie Barker's sitcoms. They're all about sort of suppressing the ambitions. I mean, Ronnie Barker in Porridge is obviously in prison, but even what's it called when he's in the shop?
Open All Hours.
Open All Hours. I mean, it's all about suppressing David Jason's ambitions and keeping him.
It is. It really is. It's crushing him, not allowing him his freedom. It's these claustrophobic relationships, which I think reflected how people were in their little communities, and they couldn't ever leave, and they were trapped in these dreadful marriages. Love has long since vanished, but you just sort of locked together forever. Lots of comedy, British comedy, is about failure. Failure to escape, to fly, to flourish. You're left there, left behind by life. Though I wonder who it is that actually might be living these wonderful, successful, glorious lives and having these tremendous existences. Maybe nobody. So when you do look at them, people are sort of making jokes, because otherwise, what would they do? I mean, scream.
So coming back to one of the funniest episodes in the book, even though it's right in the midst of the tragedy, is when Charles Hawtrey accidentally sets his house on fire.
Oh, he did. He set his house on fire. He was upstairs in bed with his rent boy called Steve, and he'd left a burning cigarette on the sofa downstairs. Up there, that ignited, and the house went up in flames, and he was in bed. And he had to be when the fire brigade climbed up the ladder to rescue him from the top floor in this tall townhouse he had in Deal, he was clutching a melting telephone, and that's like some Salvador Dali image, isn't it? So there, Charlie Hawtrey was clutching the melting telephone, and the fire brigade carried him down on their ladder, which he thoroughly enjoyed. But then he insisted on going back because he'd left his wig behind in the bedroom, and he said he can't. So anyway, they couldn't go back up. What they did instead was the fireman put his big yellow helmet on Charlie Hawtrey, and there are these rather strange photographs that the press took of Charlie Hawtrey outside his own house, which is in flames, and he's wrapped in a blanket and he's wearing a big yellow fireman's helmet, and that was sort of where people were reminded he was still alive, because he hadn't made any films for about 10 years or so, and there he was, this sort of sad figure who not long after that died from, well, he had all the veins and arteries of his legs all seized up because of all his chain smoking down the years, and he had to have an amputation. And he said no, he didn't want his legs chopped off. He wanted to die with his boots on, which he did. And I don't think many people attended the funeral. And he's in some ashes scattered anonymously in some crematorium in London, Mortlake, might it be, somewhere like that.
I mean, you make the point that if he'd been born 10, 20, 30 years later, he would have been either nostalgically rediscovered, and someone would have worked out a TV series or a docudrama that he could star in and feed on the nostalgia, or he would have been in a generation of like Graham Norton's and Alan Carr's and where not only was being gay not necessarily an obstacle, it actually became something of a qualification at one point.
Yeah, he would have. He could have been part of that, instead of feeling that he had to live in shame. He could have flourished, and he would have maybe had his own chat show, and he could have been, as you say, like Graham Norton, who I think is a brilliant interviewer, entertainer. He's sort of the new Michael Parkinson. And Hawtrey it would have been nice to have had for his final years to have been full of fulfillment rather than neglect.
So, final question: what is your favourite Carry On of the lot?
I enjoy the French Revolution one, Carry On, Don't Lose Your Head, in which Charlie Hawtrey plays the Duc de Pomfret. And Peter Butterworth is I think he's, or was it Kenneth Williams is Camembert, the big cheese. And Charlie Hawtrey's about to be guillotined, and someone comes along with a message for him, and he just says, wrote this rolled up scroll, and he says, "Oh, just put it in the basket. I'll read it later." It's about to be beheaded.
Beautiful.
And he's full of this sort of cheerful Charlie Hawtrey behaviour, even when he's on the scaffold.
Absolutely.
And he looks really good in a sort of powdered wig and one of those sort of brocade frock coats, sort of 18th century gear. It really suits him.
You can imagine him turning up in Barry Lyndon. He'd why not?
Yes,
Leonard Rossiter's in there.
Leonard Rossiter is in that. Yes, when Kubrick stopped using Peter Sellers, he started using Leonard Rossiter, didn't he? He was also in 2001. And then he, as you say, he's in Barry Lyndon. And yes, Charlie Hawtrey could have tottered across the big screen, and I'm sure he'd have rather fancied Ryan O'Neill.
Definitely.
You'd have ogled him.
Absolutely. Well, Liz and Roger, thank you so much for joining me again. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. and hopefully we'll talk some more.
Yes, I'm sure we will. Thanks ever so much, John.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.